There has been a lot of discussion in the media recently about how McLaren are jeopardizing Lando Norris's chance at the Drivers' Championship by not prioritizing him over Oscar Piastri. Some have said that the reason is a clause in Oscar's contract stating that he cannot be made the number 2 driver. But could the reason be that he still has a shot at the Drivers' Championship? And does Charles Leclerc still have a shot as well? I've crunched the numbers to find out. So the points standings after Monza are as follows. Max Verstappen is in the lead with 303 points. Lando Norris is 62 points behind him. Charles Leclerc is a further 24 points back, and then Oscar is a further 20 points back from there. I've also included Carlos, Lewis, Sergio, and Russell on this chart as they all still have a chance at winning the drivers, as slim as it may be. With 8 Grand Prix and 3 sprint races remaining, there is a maximum of 224 points up for grabs. For each of these drivers, I've crunched the numbers to figure out how many points they need to average per race in order to make up the deficit to the drivers ahead of them. First up is Lando Norris, and this has been talked about quite a lot in the media because he is definitely the one with the best chance of catching Max, as he only has to make up a deficit of 8 points per race in order to pass Max for the drivers. There are multiple scenarios that will allow Lando to catch this margin on Max, the most obvious being a P1 finish with Max finishing P2 or below, although Lando will probably need to also secure the fastest lap. Now Lando can still finish P2, but that would mean Max would have to finish P5 or below, which is a lot less likely unless the car continues to be as bad as it was in Monza. There might be a few tracks that this will happen at. I'm thinking specifically Singapore because of how bad it was when they had the most dominant car ever, but it's tough to see Max struggling to that degree at every single race. So that basically means that Lando pretty well has to win as many races as he can in order to make up that deficit every week to Max. But now let's get to the main point of the video that I wanted to make, which is, do Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri still have a shot at the drivers? Charles has to make up 11 points to Max every race weekend, but also has to make up 3 points to Lando every race weekend because of that 24-point deficit that he currently has to him. The scenarios for Charles get a little bit more complicated in that he has to outrace both Max and Lando in order to win. Now, if Charles gets P1 with fastest lap, then he will gain that 11 points on Max if Max finishes P3 or below, or without the fastest lap, P4 or below. But Lando can finish P2 or below, and as long as Charles finishes ahead of him, he'll gain back that deficit that he has. So essentially, Charles is almost in the same situation that Lando is, in that he has to win out in order to have a chance at the championship. Except for in Charles' case, he has less margin for error because if he finishes P2, Max would have to finish P7 or below, which just seems completely unlikely. Unless the Red Bull's car's pace falls completely off a cliff, I think it's going to be pretty tough. And the fact that the McLaren is so strong, it's going to be really tough for Charles to consistently finish ahead of Lando and Oscar in a race. Now, I do think this is possible, particularly with 2 of Ferrari's stronger tracks coming up in Baku and Singapore, but I don't know if Charles would be able to continue that form over the other tracks that McLaren will likely have a stronger car at, such as Qatar and Austin. Now, the other driver that I wanted to talk about was Oscar Piastri. Now, Oscar needs to make up 13 points to Max per race weekend, 6 points to Lando, and 3 points to Charles. And this is what makes coming from several positions down so much more difficult, is because there are other drivers that you also need to finish ahead of, but they also have to place in a specific order, because otherwise there's still a chance that other drivers could finish over you, even though you are finishing first. So really, the option that Oscar has is that he has to finish P1 with or without the fastest lap, and Max has to finish P4 or below in order to gain the 13 points that he needs to every race weekend. And Lando has to finish P2 or below every race weekend for him to gain the 6 back on him. And then Charles would have to finish behind Lando at any position in order for Oscar to gain back the 3 points that he needs on Charles every weekend. But because Lando and Oscar are in the same car and they are in the most dominant car, as much as this situation is more complicated, it feels more possible for Oscar to win than Charles to win. But then there's also the other issue of Lando is almost getting to the point as well where he's going to have to win out. And so every time that Oscar wins or Charles wins, it's taking away from Lando's ability to make up the points that he needs to Max. So I think it is still clearly the most likely scenario that Max is going to win this, because I think Oscar, Lando, and Charles are going to continue to take points off of each other. And there's always the possibility that we'll have a rogue Mercedes finish high up, or even a Carlos Sainz might have a good race here and there, because we all know how he dominated at Singapore in 2023. So the verdict that I have reached is that any one of Lando, Charles, and Oscar basically has to win out in order to have any shot at the drivers. The only chance that Lando, Charles, or Oscar have is if the Red Bull gets worse and continues to place outside the top 5 in every race. Otherwise, I think if Max is still able to finish in the top 5, it's going to be really tough for any one of these drivers to get ahead of him in the driver's standings. Now, just for fun, I thought I would take a look at what it might take for the other drivers who still have a mathematical chance to win the Drivers' Championship. And first up, we have Carlos Sainz. Carlos would have to make up 15 points per race weekend to Max, 7 points to Lando, 4 points to Charles, and 2 points to Oscar. This basically means that Carlos would have to win out, with Max finishing P5 or below, Lando finishing P2 or below, and then Charles and Oscar finishing below that. And while this still seems to be possible, I don't really see a scenario in which Carlos is dominating in the Ferrari when Charles is his teammate. So unfortunately, I do not think that Carlos has a shot at the drivers. Next is Lewis Hamilton, who currently has a 139-point deficit to Max. So he would have to make up 17 points a race weekend to Max, 10 points to Lando, 7 points to Charles, 4 points to Oscar, and 3 points to Carlos. So you can see how this starts to get more complicated. In this situation, Lewis would have to win out, and Max would have to finish P6 or below every single race weekend for Lewis to gain that 17 back on Max. Then Lando would also have to finish P3 or below to gain the 10 back on him. And then Charles, Oscar, and Carlos can finish any position below P2. So this seems very unlikely, primarily because I don't think Max is going to finish P6 or below every race. And also because of the strength of the McLaren, I don't see how Lando could finish P3 or below on every single remaining race. He'll get some P2s in there for sure, even if Lewis wins out. So this scenario is also very unlikely to happen. Next is Sergio, who has a 160-point deficit to Max. So he would have to make up 20 points a race weekend to Max, 12 to Lando, 9 to Charles, 7 to Oscar, 5 to Carlos, and 3 to Lewis. So Sergio would have to win out and have his teammate finish P7 or below, which I think would require a divine miracle to happen. Because if Sergio all of a sudden found this pace, you would think that Max would as well. So this one's just not happening, folks. I'm sorry. But then in addition to that, Lando would have to finish P4 or below, Charles P3 or below, and then Oscar, Carlos, and Lewis would have to finish P2 or below. So this one's just not happening, folks. And finally, we have George Russell, who currently has a 175-point deficit to Max. His deficit would have been a lot smaller if not for that disqualification in Spa, in which case I think he would have a 148-point deficit instead, if you count the 25 points that he lost plus the 2 that Max gained from Russell's disqualification. But at a 175-point deficit, he would have to make up 22 points to Max, 14 to Lando, 11 to Charles, 9 to Oscar, 7 to Carlos, 5 to Lewis, and 2 to Sergio. So again, George would have to win out, with Max finishing P7 or below, Lando finishing P4 or below, Charles P3 or below, and then the rest of Oscar, Carlos, Lewis, and Sergio all finishing P2 or below. With the pace that Max, Lando, and Charles have, this is also an impossible scenario. I'm sorry to all you George fans out there. So I can't believe I'm saying this. If we want a driver's champion who isn't Max Verstappen, we have to cheer for one driver to dominate the rest of the races. That is the only scenario I foresee in which one of Lando, Charles, or Oscar could win the driver's championship. But if that Red Bull gets worse, then any of these drivers have a shot at the championship. And so that is why I think that McLaren haven't fully shut Oscar down in terms of assisting Lando to get that championship. And Charles Leclerc also has an opportunity here if he can string together some wins as well. So we shall see what happens in some of these races coming up that the Red Bull might not be good at. And we will also see if these drivers continue to take points off of each other, because it's just going to fall right into Max Verstappen's lap if that continues to happen. So I hope you enjoyed this thought experiment. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this content and want something similar to it in the future from me. I finally have some time coming up, so hopefully I can put more content out like this as we see what happens in the Drivers' Championship and what happens in the Constructors' Championship in the final 8 races of the 2024 season. I can't wait to see what happens.